Okay, so when I was watching this video, Oren mentioned Christopher Lasch. I think it was in this one, The Revolt of the Elites, when he was talking about the cathedral. That sounded interesting. So I Googled the book. There it is. Passionate, compelling, and disturbing argument that the ills of democracy in the United States today arise from the default of its elites. That's November. I presume that's November the 3rd. Okay, so I Googled, and this, started watching it. Looks interesting, so I thought I'd share it. Coming from the place of, may as well socialize, make social some research because it's more interesting as long as I don't lose control of it, like but sometimes happens if I invite participation from the outside world. So I watched a few minutes of this and it looks really interesting, so I thought I'd share it.
I'm going to deal with the middle part of Christopher Lasch's Revolt of the Elites tonight. And just to give you a preview of where we're headed, there's quite a bit we're going to cover. Uh, One thing he does in this part of the book
Hopefully you
is
can hear
deal with what he
this.
calls the third
Let me know if you
place,
can't.
the decline of the third place, where people meet, where it's not the home and it's not work. And, you know, your neighborhood bar, your restaurant, whatever, where did that go and what's the impact of that? He's going to talk about social isolation and the many reasons for it, including our modern notion of marriage. He's going to talk about the
Interesting.
decline of neighborhood life, the way that neighborhoods have become more or less just a place to park your car, or they don't have any distinctiveness, they don't have any neighborly feel. He's going to also write about
Dublin, anyone?
false tribalism, in which cultural forces try to keep people apart instead of giving them some sort of common culture. He's also going to talk about how progress is not working for all people. We've already gotten a glimpse of this. There's the small global professional class that doesn't really, in his view, have all that much to do with or all that much in common with the rest of the people, many of whom are working for them or selling them stuff at Walmart. He's also going to discuss the decline of politics. In his view, politics is really kind of a lost art. He also talks about how we're over mediated, that politicians need to find a way to speak directly to each other and to us. And he also complains quite a bit about the state of higher education and what it is and is not doing, but especially the idea that it's been sort of overtaken by the market. So there's a lot to cover here. He himself covers a lot of ground. Actually, the very last thing that he says is extremely interesting. So I encourage you to stick around for this entire bit. Just giving you the highlights. And so the first uh, subject that he talks about is the so called third place. And he says it's the pub and the coffee shop, or I would also add the neighborhood restaurant, which at first appear to have nothing to do with politics or the civic arts, he says, make their contribution to the kind of wide ranging, freewheeling conversation on which democracy thrives. And now even they are threatened with extinction as neighborhood hangouts give way to shopping malls, fast food chains, and takeouts. Our approach to eating and drinking is less and less mixed with ritual and ceremony. It has become strictly functional. We eat and drink on the run. Our fast paced habits neither leave time nor, more important, places for good talk, even in cities, the whole point of which, it might be argued, is to promote it. He's got a point there. You go to a big city, you expect to be around a lot of people, and you are, but it doesn't necessarily increase the amount of actual contact that you have with them. And so, with shopping malls, fast food chains, takeout food, and so on, reason for us to go, he's saying, and hang around people we don't know long enough to actually strike up a conversation with them. This was published in 1994, and I guess that was before the internet had become such a pervasive part of everybody's lives, where their social life and a lot of their economic life was online too. So that's certainly added to the phenomenon. And we usually think that this is a recipe for loneliness, which is he's not disputing, but he's talking about the civic consequences of it. That we are not together we don't hang out with other people that we don't know well long enough to actually form any sort of conversation with them. In the third place, he says decency is more highly regarded than wealth or brilliant achievement. And that would be because people don't even know how wealthy or brilliant you are when they meet you in the diner. And decency, he says, we might add, is the preeminent civic or political virtue. The decline of participatory democracy may be directly related to the disappearance of third places. Then, in addition to the disappearance of third places, he says that we've placed a great deal of emphasis on this one institution of marriage to provide all the sociability that is now lacking because of our overly isolated lives. He said it was a new and basically flawed ideal of marital intimacy, not the women's movement that undermines single sex sociability. Like the shopping mall, marital togetherness was essentially a suburban invention. I can try to break that down a little bit. We place too much emphasis on this one partner to fulfill all of our social, psychological, and spiritual needs. No one can do that. That's probably why.
Oh, I've been in that situation. Okay, yeah. Where my partner had that view of marriage. Well, we weren't married, but relationship, key romantic relationship. We may as well have been married.
So many marriages end up in divorce. You're over relying on your spouse when your marriage turns into some sort of battle in which you claim that you're not getting enough attention, etc. But this is the American marriage when it still exists. So there's this overemphasis on the saving effect of this one relationship. He also talks about how at the same time that we've had a decline in sexual segregation, meaning that women have been able to move into various other spheres of life that they weren't allowed to before, we have more segregation by age. And again, he's focusing on the civic impact of this. The tavern used to be, he says, an important agency linking generations and encouraging young man to set aside the lesser habits of adolescence. It's a place you could go where you'd meet other men, and or if you're talking about, now in 1994 when he's writing, men and women both being able to hang out like that. But with the decline of the third place, you don't have that, and the American society moves in the direction of age segregation. So if
Yeah, I remember that sort of rite of passage of well, I'd been in the bar before, but I remember when I was 18 or 19, an older fella, he was a family man and a member of the football club, sort of like invited me up to the bar, but it was like he was treating me like a man, sort of like bringing me into the society, rite of passage. Come on up and have a chat, he said. So it felt like it was very much like being a rite of passage there. And I'm not sure if you don't have these third places, these taverns, I'm not sure if that goes on.
If people hang out, so to speak, it's in a
tavern is just one example, one potential example of it, the bar. Obviously, this conversation took place in 2018, pre-COVID. So COVID is just completely smashing any social place, physical place where people can gather. Never mind the specific role of the third place. This guy Lasch has identified this specific function that provides for society. Like, for example, place for sexual segregation, rites of passage, transfer of knowledge, and through the generations.
Social group or a club or a church club or whatever that actually often explicitly says it's for this age group. Well, how are people supposed to learn from each other or hear each other's experience so that we can become a community of citizens if we're segregated by age? Top that thought off, he says the organization of childhood by adults has to be seen as another chapter in the decline of the third place and the corresponding rise of that powerful dissolving agent known as the American way of life. Now, of course, what he means by that is we choreograph our children's childhood, and do not allow them to be impacted by random chance, right? Of meeting up with other kids we don't know, or of interacting with us in an informal way. Everything has to be sort of programmed, or at least that's the experience of the middle class and up. He has a chapter on how big
Yeah, spermie. Yeah. Even as a parent, I remember that having that imposed by my partner. Yeah, I would have been one for letting it. Well, they were very young, to be fair. But I see that happening with them now, even that everything is choreographed. Mind you, they live in a massive city. But if they lived in a smaller community, you could give them a bit more freedom, like the sort of freedom I had when I was a teenager, or, well, kid growing up, to just go off in the back down the road and play football, or go the other direction, down the back of the house, into the fields, down to the streams on my own, usually.
cities like New York used to foster this idea that you could be of an ethnic group.
I'm going to read this first. So just shut her up for a second. Find your tribe, man. Yeah, it was already starting in the 80s and 90s with goths and cure heads, near emo. I was already, I was already in business by that stage, so bypassed me. You get your youth cultures of today.
Um, you could be of a certain
Tribalisms.
tribe, but you were also part of the larger American society and culture. But he says here in chapter 7 the new tribalism, which finds favor not only among postmodernist academics, but in the media, in the world of commercial entertainment, and in the cultural boutiques and salons frequented by yuppies, appears on the scene at the very moment when tribalism has ceased to have any substantive content. Those city neighborhoods, he says, are being destroyed in the name of economic progress. A yuppie, by the way, is a 1980s acronym for Young Urban Professional. He says, Tribalism is the latest fashion thrown up by a consumerist capitalism that is rapidly replacing neighborhoods with shopping malls, thereby undermining the very particularism it eagerly packages as a commodity. Well, that's interesting because he's saying that people are trading an actual sort of, in some cases, ethnic identity, which sat better with the overall American culture for a sort of false tribalism that is more like um, a consumable, an identity that's sort of prepackaged and actually is profitable in
with products that you can buy. Think of yeah, for example, Cure Heads. There was like CDs, records, hairspray, clothes, music magazines. Yeah, so it was a yeah consumer. And it always a consumer movement.
which going to a shopping mall, of course, they used to exist. Now it's, what, strip malls and the internet. But going to a shopping mall and buying clothing that, uh, identifies you with a particular group or with a particular sub uh, culture. I think that's the kind of thing he's talking about. Then in chapter 9, he turns to the economy. And he claims, and we've already gotten kind of a hint of this in the first part of the book, that the progress that is extolled by the so called elites is
I'll do the same thing. Just stop her for a second. But I read it. An enlightened public capable of following the issues of the day and of making informed judgments about civic affairs. Huh, I think so. Instead, we find college graduates working at jobs for which they are vastly overqualified.
uh, is
And this is written in the 90s, but cool. Still holds.
progress for them, but isn't progress equally for everybody. And this is creating a rift in American society. And this was again in 1994. He says the social effects of the communications revolution, we are told, will include, that would be like the information revolution, I think is more or less the same. He says will include an insatiable demand for trained personnel, an upgrading of the skills required for employment, and an enlightened public capable of following the issues of the day and of making informed judgments about civic affairs. Instead, we find college graduates working at jobs for which they are vastly overqualified. The demand for menial labor outstrips the demand for skilled specialists. The post industrial economy, it appears, promotes an interchangeability of personnel, a rapid movement of one type of work to another, and a growing concentration of the labor force in technically backward, labor intensive, non union sectors of the economy. So, I mean, one of the reasons for this is that technology has progressed so rapidly that many tasks that used to be done by people are done by computers and by machines. This and manufacturing in many cases going overseas means that a lot of people are left in more precarious service type employment. They may not be doing backbreaking labor anymore. They may be doing the same type of task all day long using a computer, or behind a checkout register. But he's saying that, they may have a higher education, um, but they don't technically need it to do the jobs that they are doing. And oftentimes people graduate from college, and get a job that is of that nature, because that's all there is. So he begins to make the point that, educated or not, most people who work in this new economy don't have, and maybe don't need to have to do their jobs, the kind of education it would take in order to be citizens in the truest sense of the word. And he goes into this discussion of the decline of politics. He complains about the decline in political debate, and he tries to bust through some myths. He says political debate began to decline around the turn of the century. That's the 20th century. Curiously enough, he says, at a time when the press was becoming more responsible, more professional, more conscious of its civic obligations. In the early 19th century, the press was fiercely partisan. Until the middle of the century, papers were often financed by political parties. So he's saying that our often heard complaint that the media is biased, that it's partisan and such, and that this is the reason why we don't have actual information coming through, and we don't have really good debates. We have shouting matches. That he doesn't seem to think that's the reason. Apparently he thinks that people can be fairly well informed even if they're being served by a very partisan press, as long as that press is actually um, giving information, not just facts, but arguments, and arguments well made. What Christopher Lasch really seems to dislike is the type of thing that's become exemplified in these debates, especially the latest round of presidential debates, where people are just basically taking pot shots at each other, or on cable news, these days, when various pundits are going back and forth with each other. Lash seems to think this is encouraged by the media because basically it makes them money. It turns politics and debate into not politics and debate, but some sort of sideshow, or actually the main event, you know, of entertainment. But this is not informative. He says that candidates should instead insist on directly debating each other, instead of responding to questions put to them by commentators and pundits, like the debates of old, basically, where no one mediated. This is interesting. He says the candidates' passivity in this regard, their passivity and subservience to the media, lower them in the eyes of the voters. They need to recover their self respect by challenging the media's status as arbiters of public discussion. I guess this would be something like, if we had to translate that into today's um, experience, it would be something like the presidential candidates having a debate, like some of these public intellectuals, like, say, Jordan Peterson debating Christopher Hitchens. This is kind of prophetic because, these debates are going on all the time now on the internet amongst these public intellectuals, and people love it. I mean, they're getting huge audiences, they're taking it into various cities, and putting these things out for live audiences, so it's even coming off the internet into your arena or whatever. Obviously, we have a public that is kind of starving for this kind of thing. And imagine if presidential candidates did that, without the mediation of, say, cable news networks. However many, candidates together with a bunch of mics sitting around a table talking and having to deal with each other. That that would be really interesting. So Lash says a refusal to play by the media's rules would make people aware of the vast illegitimate influence of the mass media that has come to exercise in American politics. It would also provide the one index of character that voters could recognize and applaud. And finally, he
Yeah, that decency thing she was talking about earlier. Well, that he pulled out of Lasch's work, decency would come across, you know, you have to be decent with each other, otherwise it'll come across badly to the public. Uh,
Gets to higher education. And this is such an excellent point. I just need to emphasize this. This is really true in my experience. He says economic stratification means that a liberal education, such as it is, has become the prerogative of the rich, together with a small number of students recruited from select minorities.
read it first.
A liberal education means the liberal arts and sciences, classes in literature, philosophy, history, economics, biology, chemistry, blah, blah, blah.
That's what YouTube's for.
Modern languages. What it takes to get a Bachelor of Arts degree is being derided as impractical, because it doesn't lead directly to some sort of specific job in every case. People have more or less been sold a bill of goods that that's what an education is all about. And so what he's saying is the rich still have access to the type of education that they need to actually take part in the political process and be citizens and run the country. Whereas the rest of us, the hoi polloi, so to speak, are being told to get a practical, more or less vocational education. And it's not that people who are in business and accounting can't get a liberal education, but they'd have to go out and get it. And universities might need to require more liberal education added to such a degree. Um, but they're squeezing out that type of education so that many students come out with a bachelor's degree that is vocational. He says the great majority of college students relegated to institutions that have given up even the pretense of a liberal education study business, accounting, physical education, public relations, and other practical subjects. They get little training in writing, seldom read a book, and graduate without exposure to history, philosophy, or literature. Their only acquaintance with the world's culture comes through required courses like Introduction to Sociology and General Biology. That type of flat education relegates them to fill a slot in the economy, but doesn't give them a lot of tools for expanding beyond that slot, and certainly does not help them become more engaged and powerful democratic citizens. Lasch argues that a lot of people in higher education are out of touch, but not out of touch in the way that a lot of people who are critics of higher education think they are. The criticism is that there's somehow it's nonsensical, this notion of cultural Marxism. There really is no such things. Those two terms are opposed to each other. In my experience, they're not even mainly left wing anymore. They're highly professional people who are, there to create other professionals. But the problem is, higher education doesn't encourage academics to speak to the general public. He says no one gets tenure by writing for the general public. Instead, they write books and articles that are aimed at academia. So they're read by very few people. He says they write self referential literary studies, which means that they cite each other and they may read each other within these very narrow little realms. Um, but their way of communicating cannot penetrate outside the ivory tower, which is why no one needs to be afraid of the influence of of academics at the moment. But shouldn't they? Because this is the brain trust, so to speak, of the country, or at least one part of it, that is spending far too much time more or less spinning webs, rather than having any sort of social impact. In fact, it's frowned upon to have a popular and social impact. And I'll just leave you with this. This is a very long quote. Sorry, but this is from the end of, or near the end of chapter 9, which is the second part of the book. But it's just so right on. He says, when the children of the 60s received their professorships and deanships, they did not abandon the dream of radical cultural transformation. They set out to implement it. Now, instead of attempting to destroy our education institutions physically, they are subverting them from within. No doubt they would like to think so, but their activities do not seriously threaten corporate control of universities. And it is corporate control, not academic radicalism, that has corrupted our higher education. So let me pause there. Okay. Um, he's saying some of those 60s hippies, they got into the professoriate. They thought they were going to become radicals and change the world. But really, all they did was spin webs. And meantime, corporate control of the universities became a real thing, and their own interests were tied up with that corporate control. So he writes, it is corporate control that has diverted social resources from the humanities into military and technological research, fostered an obsession with quantification that has destroyed the social sciences, replaced the English language with bureaucratic jargon, and created a top heavy administrative apparatus whose educational vision begins and ends with the bottom line. One of the effects of corporate and bureaucratic control is to drive critical thinkers out of the social sciences into the humanities, where they can indulge a taste for theory without the rigorous discipline of empirical social observation. Theory is no substitute for social criticism, the one form of intellectual activity that would seriously threaten the status quo, and the one form that has no academic cachet at all. Social criticism that addressed the real issue in higher education today, the university's assimilation into the corporate order, and the emergence of a knowledge class whose subversive activities do not seriously threaten any vested interest, would be a welcome addition to contemporary discourse. For obvious reasons, however, this kind of discourse is unlikely to get much encouragement either from academic left or from its critics on the right. That would be because the academic left gets paid for spinning webs of theory, I guess, is what he's saying. And the right is pretty much getting what it wants because most of the university is working for it, for corporate interests, let's say. It has become
Well,
extremely pragmatic. It is creating
it's an old-fashioned
refugees. It's also funded in a lot of colleges. There's an awful lot of
conception of
funding
that.
direct from private industry to support the research and the type of professors that they think will benefit the country, because um, they benefit their bottom line. That sort of selling out to the corporation so that what you teach is what corporate interests want you to teach is precisely the type of thing that happened when scientists supported the tobacco industry, which Oreskes writes about in Merchants of Doubt, which is why I put up that previous video. We would be naive to think that
2021, definitely. Big pharma and science, right. Mike Eden, listen to Mike Eden talking about the corruption of the academy. There's no academic freedom.
there's absolutely
University science departments are completely corrupted. sponsorship from big pharma through the big pharma's influence on government. If you speak out against the government, you get your funding cut. Centralization of science, centralization. They lack, well, whatever way it's been set up, centralization of funding. I don't know if he's got any solutions, but certainly he's diagnosing the issue, which has prevented scientists who privately have deep suspicions about, deep concerns about the COVID narrative, can't say anything without risk of losing their funding. Mike Eden could speak up because he has left. He's left big pharma and he's academically free as well. He's not in an institution. Hasn't been for decades. And he's financially independent, so he was able to speak out.
Absolutely no.
But his friends and contacts that are still in academia are 6 out of 7 couldn't speak out, wouldn't speak out. They all can, but chose not to. But he knows their private thoughts, and they agree with him. Dr. Mike Eden, ex-VP of Pfizer.
Influence on the way people think and their findings. And I think this is a lesson for all of us that we have yet to really imbibe. What's that phrase? He who pays the piper gets to basically call the song. So Christopher Lasch has kind of thrown a lot at us here. I think a lot of this is really pretty prescient. It's pretty relevant for our current situation, even though it's over 20 years old. But he could see many things coming. So next time I'll try to take on the third part of the book and we'll finish it up, I think. All right, bye.
Right, that was pretty good. I just happened to find that middle part. Christopher Lasch. Let's have a look at her. Let's subscribe. Give her a sub. It's 2018. Oh, yeah, I can search her channel for this. I'm trying to work out the way she's numbered these. It seems to be Christopher Lasch is a series. Christopher Lasch, that's number 2. Number 3. No, we just watched number 4. Okay. So, yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt the regularly scheduled environmental political thought lectures to talk about Christopher Lasch. Maybe some of you have heard the name Christopher Lasch, but a lot of people haven't, and that's a shame. Christopher Lasch is, among many other things, a sort of contrarian, and I love contrarians. I love people who think differently and don't fit into a box easily, because I think that's what we need more of to solve problems that can't be neatly fit into any boxes. Lasch died in 1994, and I'll be covering the last book that he wrote that was actually written. It was written in his final years, published after he died. That book is The Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy. As I often do, I pulled up all the quotes of Lasch on the Google page. The ones that just come up without any citation or whatever. I just think it's kind of an interesting exercise to see what is the first thing that you see about a person? Because that's kind of their stamp for right, for better or worse, correctly or incorrectly. In this case, the quotes encompass some of what Lasch was about. I think they give you a taste of his kind of contrarian style, but they do not encompass everything he thought by any means. I'm just going to read a few of these. They're probably so small on your screen you can't actually read them unless you freeze and expand your view. But here's some of them. The family is a haven in a heartless world. That was actually the title of one of his other books. Nothing succeeds like the appearance of success. I like that because, he was sensitive to the fact that much of the modern mentality had more to do with appearance than with substance, and he didn't approve. It is the logic of consumerism that undermines the values of loyalty and permanence and promotes a different set of values that is destructive of family life. Well, now there you begin to see his contrarianism, or at least what seems to be contrarianism, because he has combined a criticism of the market mentality of consumerism with a concern for the disintegration of the family. Lasch was of the opinion that one of the most corrosive things going to destroy the family was actually a certain type of capitalism. Lasch is very hard to pin down if you're looking for a nice and neat and tidy left versus right type of dichotomy and you want to know where to plunk him. You're not going to be able to do it. He says a growing awareness of the depth of popular attachment to the family has led some liberals to concede that family is not just a buzzword for reaction. There you see his little bit of irony and sarcasm coming out there, as if to say, oh, those liberals have become somewhat aware of the fact that people continue to attach value to the family and that maybe they might have to think of the family as something more than just a sort of bastion of all the conservative values that they dislike. Only somebody like Christopher Lasch could say that and be listened to by people on the left at the same time. He says, in an individualistic culture, the narcissist is God's gift to the world. In a collectivist society, the narcissist is God's gift to the collective. There's always narcissists. And of course, Lash's most famous work is called The Culture of Narcissism, American Life in an Age of Diminishing Expectations. I've read that book, and one of the big takeaways that I got from that was that what he saw in his times was a diminishing focus on actual content and quality of thought and quality of character and things like that, and a growing attention to appearances, to not what was said or what was produced, but who said or who produced it. And this was the culture of narcissism. Everything was geared around the individual and his or her personality and expression. Lasch, when he died in 1994, I guess he didn't get to see really the flourishing of social media, but I imagine that he would have an awful lot to say about how social media plays into the culture of narcissism, with the idea that it's about the display of your, at least your external persona, and the consumption or consumerism of people's personalities. Anyway, moving on. He says the attempt to redefine the family as a purely voluntary arrangement grows out of the modern delusion that people can keep all their options open all the time. Lasch didn't like, well, to bump up to the last quote, he didn't much like the individualism that had come to dominate Western culture. And and here he doesn't like the idea of endless freedom. And keeping all your options open means you could never actually alight upon something that could give your life purpose and meaning. In other words, freedom is not the highest good in Christopher Lasch's worldview, even though I'm sure he would not say that freedom is something to give up, but he's one of these people that believes that one has to use one's freedom responsibly, and that, sort of being afraid of any and all commitments basically keeps you in a state of suspension, not engagement. He says the left dismisses talk about the collapse of family life and talks instead about the emergence of the growing new diversity of family types. Again, there's a criticism of the left. He was very inspired by left leaning thought, but he could see the weaknesses in the left's position. They dismissed the family too easily. The family is an institution that could keep people protected to a certain extent from the predatory economy. The capitalist economy could become less of a problem if you could keep your social institutions and your cultural values intact. But but the economy, in his view, is very corrosive to them. And his criticism of liberalism is here that they don't really help to preserve that bastion of security and protection from the economy. Every age develops its own peculiar forms of pathology, which express in exaggerated form its underlying character structure. Well said. If we look at what's going on today, I think that if we looked at it through Christopher Lasch's lens, if in as much as you may think that there are things that are screwed up and wrong, you'd have to ask yourself how you partook of the same culture, how you, in effect, contribute to it. Um, in other words, instead of laying the blame at somebody else's feet, you'd have to look at your own participation in it and approval of this larger societal character. Conservatives have no understanding of modern capitalism, he says. They have a distorted understanding of the traditional values they claim to defend. Okay, there's a criticism of conservatives. He thinks, and I agree with him, that many conservatives, haven't actually noticed that the economy has changed drastically over time and that their view of free market capitalism is actually some sort of mythology. It's a
Throwback.
story that people
Yeah.
tell, and it keeps them from being able to see uh, what the economy really
Corporations.
has become. And if you can't see what it has become, then how to harness it or how to make it work better for people, you can't ask those questions. And of course, conservatism ought to be about every ideology of substance ought to be about making people happier, making preserving the ways of life that they value and want or say they want. Anyway, in Lasch's view, you can't extol traditional values and have no criticism of the modern capitalist economy, which seems to do its best to break up families, to disintegrate common culture, to trivialize, deeply held feelings and commitments, distract people into entertainment and away from actually doing meaningful things with their lives and for other people, etc. Last quote, he
Optimization.
says, ostensibly rigorous and realistic, contemporary conservatism is an ideology of denial. Its symbol is a smile button. Well, that kind of goes along with what I already said. It's a kind of mythology. It's not the only kind of conservatism there is. But I think that Lasch's criticism of the conservatism of his time, um, which was pretty heavily leaning in the classical liberal direction, the sort of Reaganite conservatism ideology, um, in which, if we just kind of peeled back government and we empowered the individual, it would be more or less, perfect harmony and morning in America. um,
Might have worked in the
Lash
50s.
would ask tough questions like, you know has government ever gotten smaller? Has the influence of government actually ever decreased? What is the fate of the small entrepreneurial businessman or woman in America? How easy is it for them to compete with larger scale businesses? Does consumerism make people happy, or does it feed off of dissatisfaction? These are the kind of questions that he asks, which are really useful no matter what, um, no matter what ideology you adhere to. I would maintain they're useful. Back up a little bit, I just wanted to point out Christopher Lasch is not a political theorist, but yet he is, because that's what he did in his books. But he basically uses his knowledge of history, and a lot of his work is actually biographical. He goes and he delves into the lives and workings of particular individuals or groups, and he fleshes them out and he uses them as examples of what he called on that last page peculiar forms of pathology. I found his obituary still on the University of Rochester's website, and I just wanted to read a couple of things from it. But it says, Lasch gained national notoriety for his discomforting analyses of American society, the culture of narcissism in which he predicted Americans would turn to increasing consumption during the 1980s, became a bestseller and led to a consulting invitation from President Jimmy Carter. Other notable books include Haven in a Heartless World, The Family Besieged in 1977, and The Minimal Self, Psychic Survival in Troubled Times in 1984. His book, Revolt of the Elites and the Betrayal of Democracy, is to be published by Norton this fall. And here's just a couple more quotes. Lasch was especially interested in the American notion that each generation should do better economically than the one before. As he saw it, the idea that progress is inevitable has bred this century's social, political, and economic problems. Liberals, with whom Lasch identified himself early in his career, opposed his later writings, which lamented the breakdown of community spirit and traditional families in America. Conservatives disliked his invectives against the elitism of the Reagan era and his claims that conservatism was not a presidential priority during the 1980s. Well, Lasch gives people a lot to hate and maybe consequently a lot to love. If we can get beyond our ideological possessions, which is a term that I deal with in other videos on this channel, if we can get past our ideological possession, our sort of religiosity about our ideologies, and just try, to be a little bit more objective and maybe somewhat charitable towards other people and their opinions, up to a point, of course. I suppose we always have to say, then maybe we might be able to come up with some new ideas instead of remaining in the same grooves as Rome burns, basically. So I just wanted to deal with just a couple of things that appear in chapter 1, which is really just the introductory chapter of the Revolt of the Elites, and then I'll move on to the second chapter and go into more depth about some of the things that he says in another video. But he kind of sums up this encapsulates really well kind of the core point, maybe the biggest point that he wants to make in this book. He says, this is Christopher Lasch, he says, the culture wars that have convulsed America since the 60s are best understood as a form of class warfare in which an enlightened elite, as it thinks of itself, seeks not so much to impose its values on the majority, a majority perceived as incorrigibly racist, sexist, provincial, and xenophobic, much less to persuade the majority by means of rational public debate as to create parallel or alternative institutions in which it will no longer be necessary to confront the unenlightened at all. That should tell you why it's so important for people to know about Christopher Lasch and his point of view. Because if that isn't a description of one of the big underlying problems that has brought about the era of Donald Trump, I don't know what is. In order to be able to see this, people on the left need to be able to have some ability to let go of their disdain for Trump supporters and people that they perceive to be in that category and ask themselves, how did we get
My
here?
cousins.
What happened? Now, there are many, many reasons why, but back in 1994, Christopher Lasch is saying here that indeed liberals are not totally off the hook for responsibility, and that, as a matter of fact, a big problem, the democratic malaise, is partly due to the splitting off of the so-called enlightened elite, as it thinks of itself, he says, from the rest of the country, And he's going to go into detail about how and why and all that, how that happened. But a sort of cultural divide develops. And to a certain extent, it runs along economic divisions as well. But the cultural divide is, I think, more important for this particular point that he's making. And pretty soon, there's a lack of awareness about the lives of ordinary people, working class people, people who don't have a 401k, people who don't, drink, I don't know, cafe lattes. I have no idea. Oh, I know. That's what I get, soy lattes. Anyway, he's going to talk a lot about that divide. And there's, he's going to point the finger. And some of the ways that he points his finger are going to make people uncomfortable, especially people who think that they have had absolutely nothing to do with this and it's somebody else's fault. Today we talk about the tribalism and so on and so forth, right? But he could see back then that there were classes that were living in two different worlds, whereas previously the wealthy and the middle class and the poor um, lived outside of these super rich, which were very few, lived within a certain range of each other as far as their practices, their values, even things like what they wore, what they hate, and so forth. But as time has gone by, the gap in the way that they live and what they value and, what they think about and how they entertain themselves and all these things has widened and widened and widened to the point where there's just not enough understanding. Well, you can see how that is a huge problem for democracy because democracy works well if people can see beyond their own self interest to what's in the common interest or the common good. And like people sense that our democracy hasn't been working well for a while. So maybe Christopher Lasch has some clues in this book about why not. Finally, towards the end of this introductory chapter, he writes, well, actually,
Applies to Irish as well. Yeah, not that far, not a million miles culturally from Americans in the grand scheme of things.
this is the last paragraph. He says, in the old days, Americans agreed, at least in principle, that individuals cannot claim entitlement to wealth far in excess of their needs. The persistence of this belief, even though it is admittedly only an undercurrent in the celebration of wealth that now threatens to drown all competing values, offers some hope that all is not yet lost.
Good, good. Let's hope it still persists.
I guess the persistence of this belief refers to the notion that not everybody is comfortable yet with the idea that some individuals can claim entitlement to wealth far in excess of their needs. But I guess I would say in 2018, there's probably a lot more people in the poor and middle class that basically have acquiesced to the idea that, yes, indeed, um, people can justifiably and without moral qualms claim entitlement to wealth far in excess of their needs.
Look, I would have no problem with them doing it if it meant that they could leave the rest of us alone, but they don't. They don't. They try and become emperors, not just like use it to buy power and start to interfere with our lives in terms of decide what's decide what politics, what political opinions people are allowed to see. For example, tech oligarchs, they impose their morality on us as well through the HR corporations, Global Homo, World Economic Forum, etc. They impose their medical solutions on us. So no problem with people getting rich, but if they become so rich that that money buys them that power to be able to interfere with our lives, then no. So who needs more than 10 times, right? What is it? far in excess of their needs. Okay, in excess of your needs. So if your needs, if you can put a financial figure on human needs, who needs more than 10 times that? Right? Nobody needs. Okay, so obviously you need X that says 20K a year. Right? Just throwing that out there. I think people should be allowed to earn up to, you could put a sort of like a notional limit on it, like 200,000, like 10 times a person's needs. But why a million times their needs? Why do they need to have a million, like 20,000? That would be 20 billion, right? So 20 billion a year. I'm sure there are people that earn that, and that gives them immense power over other people's lives. That's what I object to, not the amount of money that they have, but the power that it gives them over other people's lives. So, some way to stop these big monopolies, or if we could, this is a different idea, really, but back to the coffee houses, back to the Starbucks and Costa and all the rest, rather than having those companies in Ireland taking money out, exporting capital. What about replacing them with, instead of like let's say 1,000 multinational chains, multinational outlets owned by 5 key groups with 200 each? How about having 100, sorry, 1,000 chains owned by 100 families, like an average of 10 outlets each, and that money, it's reinvested, that money stays in the country, the capital stays in the country, and 100 families that create employment is far better than 5 big companies that just create low-level employment, a few managers, and the capital goes out. Just a thought. I need to stop doing this sort of thing because it's gone from informal browsing to something a bit more demanding. I need to think about my studies. I'll finish this bit off. It's taking my mental energy away from my studies.
Anyway, all right. So
Any,
that gives you a taste of Christopher Lasch. It's an interlude. I'll get back to the environmental political thought series when I get done with this. But I've been reading this. I think it's worth sharing. And there's hardly anything out there on the internet about Christopher Lasch. There's a couple of video or like a couple of interviews, or maybe it's 2 parts of one interview. And I'm going to.
so thank you, lady. You've done yourself proud there, and Christopher Lash proud. That's a nice presentation. Much appreciated. I hope you don't mind me rebroadcasting it. You've done a good service there.
Gonna put that up in the playlist. Um,
All right.
but really, he wasn't on television very much. There's not a lot of video of him. There's not a whole lot about him, and so I think it's worthwhile just to introduce people. Hopefully, get them to think about maybe reading one of his books. All right, bye.